Has someone ever tried to make you feel guilty for choosing yourself?
You ever had someone rip your self-worth out of your chest while smiling across the dinner table? Like they were slicing turkey and your dignity with the same knife? That was me last Thanksgiving, 32 years old, back living with my parents after losing my job, holding on to scraps of pride like they were wishbones. I hadn't even finished passing the mashed potatoes when my dad, Frank, looked straight at me, with that half-sneer he wore when pretending he wasn't pissed, and said, "You're lazy. You have no future. Time to move out." Just like that. Like he was commenting on the weather. Everyone froze. Kyle, my older brother, glanced down at his plate like he didn't hear it. His wife, Samantha, did that tight-lipped suburban smile, the one women like her use when they don't know whether to laugh or cringe. My mom looked at me, then at him, and back at me again, like she was hoping I'd somehow pretend it didn't happen. And me? I nodded. I didn't cry, didn't yell, didn't defend myself. I just sat there and took a slow sip of wine from a glass I hadn't even wanted, while inside my ribs, something sharp and bitter started growing roots. The thing is, I didn't come back home to freeload. I didn't want to be 32 and living in my childhood bedroom, surrounded by old high school trophies and a framed photo of my ex from when we still thought the future would unfold like a polite brochure. I lost my job when the company downsized, first round of layoffs, budget cuts, no hard feelings, all that HR sugarcoating, and I moved back because I didn't have a choice. I applied for jobs every damn day. I took side gigs. I helped my mom with the laundry, did the grocery runs, even cooked twice a week. I wasn't perfect, but I sure as hell wasn't lazy. Frank didn't see that, though. Or he didn't want to. See, my dad's one of those old-school types who thinks anyone not working 60 hours a week and hating it is some kind of drain on society. He was Army back in the day, then construction, then retired early when his back gave out and his pension kicked in. He walks around like every dollar he's ever earned is a badge of moral superiority. He believes in tough love, which in our house really just meant emotional negligence with extra volume. Thanksgiving had already been on edge before that comment. It started the moment Kyle and Samantha walked through the door. Kyle's the golden child, software engineer, nice house in Denver, 2 kids, and a wife who posts about gratitude and grind culture like she's trying to win a competition for who can sound most like a Target commercial. They brought wine, a sweet potato casserole, and an air of judgment that you could practically smell. "So, Rachel," Samantha said while we were setting the table, "what are you up to these days?" Not, "How are you doing?" or "How's the job hunt going?" Just straight to the resume check. I gave her the most polite version of "none of your business" I could manage. Kyle didn't say much. He never does when it comes to me and Dad. He's spent years pretending that our family dynamics are normal, as long as he's out of range. Dinner started off awkward but manageable. My mom tried to smooth things over with small talk, throwing around weather updates and asking about the kids' Halloween costumes. Uncle Rick, my dad's younger brother, who always drinks a little too much, but somehow still notices everything, sat back, letting his eyes wander from face to face. I caught him watching my dad more than once, his jaw twitching every time Frank talked about earning what you get or people expecting handouts. And then, just as I was passing the mashed potatoes across the table, Frank decided to detonate the room. He didn't yell. He didn't need to. That's what made it worse. His voice was calm, that low disappointed tone he'd always used when I came home with a B instead of an A or said I wanted to major in accounting instead of engineering. "You know, Rachel," he said, setting down his fork like he was about to lecture a student who'd shown up late, "you've been here 6 months. You don't pay rent. You barely contribute. At some point, you gotta stop being a damn leech. You're 32. It's time to grow up. Get out. Get your own place. You're not a kid anymore." The words hung in the air like cigarette smoke, stale, toxic, hard to ignore. I could hear Samantha's fork clink softly against her plate as she lowered it. Kyle didn't look up. My mom's face turned a shade of pink I hadn't seen since the time Frank told her she'd ruined his chili recipe by using turkey instead of beef. "Uncle Rick?" He let out a breath through his nose like he was bracing for impact. I felt my whole body go cold, not the kind of cold that makes you shiver, but the kind that makes you aware of every inch of your skin, every heartbeat in your neck. I stared at my dad. I didn't say a word. I just nodded. Slowly. Once. Like I'd been waiting for him to say it. Because, in a way, I had. Later that night, while everyone else was pretending to enjoy the pecan pie and avoiding eye contact, I was already replaying his words in my mind. Over and over, like a scratched CD from high school, skipping on the same cruel line. It wasn't even the insult that cut deepest. It was the way he looked so damn smug afterward, like he'd just done me some twisted favor. Like I should thank him for finally telling me the truth. But what Frank didn't know, what none of them knew, was that while I'd been doing nothing, I had also been quietly keeping track. Not just of jobs and bills and rejection emails, but of a very specific piece of plastic in his wallet. A credit card. One he used often. One he never asked questions about. One he assumed, like everything else in his life, would always just be there. And as I poured myself another glass of wine and listened to Kyle talk about crypto volatility, I decided I wasn't going to raise my voice or defend myself or cry into my pumpkin pie. No. I was going to wait. Pack my things. Leave the next morning, like he told me to. And then, right before I walked out that door, I'd tell him the truth. The real truth. About the card. About the name on it. About who really paid for those golf trips and hotel suites and gas station beers he bragged about to his buddies. Because while Frank had spent the last decade pretending I was useless, he'd been spending money that didn't belong to him. And tomorrow, he'd find out just how expensive his pride really was. I didn't sleep that night, not because I was upset in the way they probably hoped I'd be. Not because I was devastated by what he said or rattled by the way everyone else let it slide like it was some harmless slip of tongue from an old man who didn't know better, but because I couldn't stop thinking about how calm I had felt in the middle of it. How deeply I had understood, in that moment of public humiliation, that this wasn't a battle I needed to fight with shouting or tears or even explanations, because the war had been going on for years and I had already won, he just didn't know it yet. The house was quiet, thick with that awkward, post-holiday silence that falls over everything like heavy snow after a blizzard. You can still see the wreckage underneath, but no one wants to deal with it right away. My mom had retreated to the den the night before, pretending to fold laundry while reruns of old game shows played in the background, and I heard my dad's footsteps cross the hallway around midnight before the creak of his recliner snapped into place. That chair, like everything else in this house, had been his throne for decades, and it never once occurred to him that maybe the kingdom he ruled was starting to rot from the inside out. I lay on my bed, not really mine anymore, technically, since the room had been repurposed several times before I moved back in, first into a kind of half-done storage unit filled with unopened exercise equipment and old VHS tapes, then into a barely usable guest room that still smelled faintly of carpet cleaner and stale cologne, staring at the ceiling and thinking about all the ways people convince themselves they're right just because they never get challenged. Frank had lived his whole life like that, speaking in absolutes, assuming that volume equals truth, mistaking silence for agreement. And I'd let him, because I didn't care enough to argue, and because deep down, I believed that one day, the silence would do more damage than any scream could ever manage. I started packing just after 5 in the morning, before the sun had fully come up, not out of some dramatic need to storm out, but because I didn't want to linger. I didn't want to give him the satisfaction of seeing me hesitate or second-guess or falter. I folded my clothes neatly, tucked away my laptop, charger, a few old journals, the framed photo of me and my mom from college graduation, the one Frank had refused to attend because he didn't believe in wasting a weekend listening to speeches from people who never worked a real job. That line had stung back then, but now it just echoed in my mind as another notch on the belt of things he'd never understand. I slid open the top drawer of my old desk and pulled out a small, worn folder I'd kept hidden behind a stack of dusty receipts. Inside was everything: statements, payment history, screenshots, printed emails from the bank, all tied to the credit card he thought belonged to him. It had started almost innocently when I was 24, just a few months into my first real job, working in a downtown accounting firm that paid barely enough to live on but gave me the illusion of progress. Frank had called me one night, out of breath and irritated, complaining that his card had been frozen because of some fraud alert, and he was trying to book a hotel for a golf tournament with his old army buddies. "Can you just open something under your name?" he'd asked. "Just for the weekend. I'll pay you back next week." I said yes, of course. That's what you do when your father asks you for help, when you're still young enough to believe that love is measured by obedience. I filled out the online application, set the limit to 5,000, and emailed him the temporary card number. I never saw the first bill. He intercepted it. He used the online portal and logged in himself. And over time, what was supposed to be a weekend loan turned into a habit. A routine. A running tab no one acknowledged. He used the card for gas, for club dues, for cigars, for hotel stays, for steak dinners with friends whose names I never recognized. Sometimes he left cash on the kitchen counter, as if tossing $20 next to the toaster made up for the fact that he was racking up thousands. Most months, I paid the minimum just to keep it from going delinquent. I told myself it wasn't worth the fight. That someday I'd close it and walk away. That day had come. Before I zipped up my suitcase, I logged into the account one last time. The balance sat at $14,782. His charges. His habits. His arrogance, all in black and white. I didn't cry. I didn't feel sorry. I didn't even feel satisfaction yet, just a strange kind of steadiness, like I was finally stepping out of a fog I didn't know I'd been living in. I clicked close account. The screen flashed a confirmation message. Just like that, it was over. Not the money, that part was still mine to untangle, but the power, the imbalance, the unspoken chain around my neck. My phone buzzed once, a text from my mom. "Breakfast is ready." No apology. No explanation. Just eggs and toast like everything was fine. I didn't answer. I left the folder on my nightstand, opened to the most recent statement, and carried my suitcase downstairs with the calmness of someone walking away from a fire they didn't start, but absolutely intended to let burn. My dad was already sitting at the table, flipping through the newspaper like he hadn't just gutted me in front of half the family less than 12 hours earlier. He looked up once, didn't say good morning, didn't ask where I was going or if I'd thought about anything he said. He just nodded toward the coffee pot and grunted something about the weather. And I realized in that moment that Frank wasn't used to people leaving him. He was used to being the one who got to slam the door, the one who set the rules, the one who always got the last word. But not this time. I poured myself a cup of coffee, black, the way he hated, and sat across from him without saying a word. I watched him pretend not to notice the packed bag by the door. I watched my mom flutter around the kitchen, wiping already clean counters and glancing over her shoulder like a hostage waiting for the guard to snap. And then, just before I stood to leave, I said, very clearly, very softly, "By the way, that credit card you've been using for the past 8 years, the one for your golf trips and hotel stays? It's been in my name since day one. You never even looked at the statements, did you? I closed it this morning." He didn't look up at first, but I saw his hands twitch. I saw the corner of the paper fold under his fingers. I saw the color drain slowly from his face like someone had turned off the tap behind his eyes. And in that moment, I understood exactly what power feels like. Not control, not revenge, not cruelty, but the cold, clean clarity of finally being seen. The morning I left, the sun hadn't even broken through the thick gray clouds hovering over our quiet little neighborhood, the kind of suburban silence that makes every sound feel louder than it should. From the clinking of silverware in the kitchen sink to the creak of the old wooden stairs beneath my suitcase wheels, and I remember thinking, as I moved down that hallway for what I decided would be the last time, that leaving like this, with no shouting, no slammed doors, no apology was the most honest way to end a chapter that had been built entirely on avoidance and quiet, slow-burning resentment. When I stepped into the kitchen, the smell of burnt toast mixed with overbrewed coffee filled the air like a stale apology, and I saw him, Frank, my father, already sitting at the table. eyes buried in the morning paper as if the ink on those pages could somehow protect him from the consequences waiting just inches away. His routine hadn't changed, not in decades. Even now, even after what he'd said to me at dinner, he sat there like he was still king of this house, this castle built on pride, denial, and his unshakable belief that authority didn't require accountability, only obedience. He didn't look up when I entered. Not immediately. Not even when the wheels of my suitcase bumped into the threshold. That old newspaper shield stayed firmly in place, like he could will me away by ignoring my presence, as if I was still the 17-year-old girl who flinched when he raised his voice or lowered his approval. But I wasn't that girl anymore, and this wasn't his story to control. I took a slow sip of coffee from a chipped mug I'd been using since middle school, the one with the faded picture of a cartoon cat and the words, "Don't talk to me until I've had my coffee," which felt more fitting now than ever. And I let the silence grow so heavy that it began to bend the air between us. My mother, true to form, hovered in the background, scrubbing the already clean counters, pretending to be busy, pretending not to notice the tension thickening like old gravy, pretending that this morning wasn't fundamentally different from any other. But she knew. Of course she did. They always do. I let the silence stretch a little longer, letting it sink into his skin, letting him stew in the tension he had created. And then, finally, I said it. "I'm heading out, like you suggested." No apology. No emotional flourish. Just the facts. He glanced up briefly, and I caught that flicker, that twitch in his brow that betrayed the smallest pang of surprise, maybe even guilt, though if it was, it died as quickly as it appeared. He cleared his throat, folded the newspaper with more force than necessary, and muttered, "Probably for the best." And that was it. That was all he had. No goodbye. No good luck. Just those 4 words, and the smug tilt of a man who believed, even now, that he'd won something. That's when I leaned forward slightly, rested my elbows on the table like I had something casual to share, and said, very clearly, very calmly, "By the way, that credit card you've been using for the last 8 years, the one you use for golf, hotels, wine clubs, gas, and whatever the hell else, it was never yours. It's mine. My name, my credit, my account. You never asked. And I never said no. But this morning I closed it. Completely. You might want to check your wallet." I watched the words land on him like a sudden weight dropped from a great height. At first, he didn't respond. He didn't blink. He didn't move. But his hands, those always steady, mechanic's hands that once rebuilt half the cars on this block, began to tremble, just slightly, like the surface of a calm lake when a sudden gust of wind disturbs it. He reached into his back pocket with mechanical slowness, pulled out his worn leather wallet, and thumbed through it with increasing urgency, stopping at the sleek black card he'd come to treat like an extension of himself. He looked at it, then looked at me, then back at the card. "What do you mean, it's yours?" His voice cracked slightly, not with fear exactly, but with the confusion of someone whose reality had just shifted a few degrees off-center. Because for men like Frank, men who equate financial control with personal worth, the idea that they've been unwittingly dependent on someone they consider beneath them is more than just uncomfortable, it's unbearable. I stood up, picked up my bag, and walked slowly to the door. I didn't look back. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. Because the silence he left in the wake of my words was louder than anything he could have said. Behind me, my mother finally turned off the sink. She didn't say anything either, but I could feel her eyes on my back, burning with the kind of quiet emotion she never let herself show: fear, maybe, or shame, or perhaps something like respect. We'd never been close, not really, but in that moment, I think she saw me more clearly than she ever had before. Outside, the air was cool, the kind of late November chill that bites your nose and makes your eyes water, and as I stepped off the porch, I felt lighter, not free exactly, because there was still a mountain of financial mess to climb through, but untethered. As though I'd cut the final thread holding me to a version of myself I no longer recognized. I got into my car, started the engine, and drove away without looking in the rearview mirror, because there was nothing back there worth seeing. I didn't cry. I didn't hesitate. I didn't feel regret. I just drove, knowing that I had taken back something far more valuable than money. I had taken back the truth. And the truth was this: Frank had spent years building a castle on the illusion of control. He told himself he was the provider, the backbone, the authority. But the reality was, he'd been living on borrowed power, my power, and now that the foundation was gone, the whole damn thing was going to start crumbling. Slowly, then all at once. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel small. I didn't feel ashamed. I felt like someone who had finally, mercifully, stopped waiting for permission to take their life back. In the days that followed, as the chill of late November deepened and the Thanksgiving decorations still hung limply from windows and doorways like some sad reminder of a celebration that never really happened, the ripple effects of my quiet departure began to spread through our family like slow poison seeping through cracks no one wanted to admit had always been there. I had expected anger, perhaps even a dramatic phone call or a flurry of accusatory texts, but what I got instead was a silence so thick, so deliberate, that it felt almost strategic. Like my father had decided the best way to strike back was by pretending I never existed at all. That was his tactic. Always had been. If you couldn't control something, you minimized it, starved it of attention, and buried it under the weight of your own stubborn pride until it either disappeared or came crawling back begging to be forgiven. But this time I didn't crawl. I didn't even flinch. Instead, I moved in with a friend from college, a woman named Marcy who had a spare room above her garage and a memory sharp enough to recall the night back in sophomore year when I cried on her futon for 2 hours straight after my dad hung up on me for saying I didn't want to go to grad school. She welcomed me with wine, leftovers, and a look that said, without needing to say a word, "It's about damn time." I took a few days to unpack, to breathe, to finally exist in a space where no one hovered outside the door waiting for me to fail. Meanwhile, back at home, the fallout was taking shape in ways I hadn't anticipated but, in hindsight, should have expected. Frank, my father, who once boasted to anyone who'd listen that he never carried debt, never needed help, never let his finances slip for even a second, had made my credit card his financial lifeline without even understanding the basic mechanics of it. He never asked why the statements didn't come in his name, never noticed the email address listed on the account, never questioned the occasional decline charge that he wrote off as bank glitches. For years, I had covered the minimums, kept the account alive, quietly absorbing the consequences of his entitled ignorance, because it was easier to keep the peace than to start a war. But now the war had started, and I hadn't even needed to fire the first shot. All I'd done was step out of the way and let gravity do the rest. Within 48 hours of me closing the card, he had tried to use it twice, once at the gas station near the highway where he liked to fill up before heading to his golf course, and once again at the clubhouse bar, where he often bragged about his independent lifestyle over overpriced scotch. The card was declined both times. Not expired. Not frozen. Declined. Dead. The first call came not to me, but to my mother. He didn't have the courage to dial my number directly. He told her, through clenched teeth and gritted shame, that something was wrong with his account. He barked at her to get answers, to fix it, to figure out how his own daughter could be so ungrateful as to ruin his finances out of spite. But my mother, who had spent decades playing referee and peacekeeper and silent observer to the hurricane of Frank's ego, finally pushed back, just a little. She didn't yell. She didn't accuse. She simply told him that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't about revenge, maybe it was about consequences. And that was when he lost it. According to Marcy, who heard it secondhand through her cousin who still worked at the same community center where my mom volunteered, Frank had slammed his phone against the wall so hard it cracked the screen. He yelled about betrayal, about how he had taken care of me, about how I owed him more than this, as if the mere act of allowing me to sleep under his roof absolved him of years of manipulation and emotional neglect. He didn't speak to my mother for 2 days after that, retreating into his recliner with a six-pack and the television turned up so loud it shook the cabinets. I didn't respond to the messages he eventually sent, not directly. Instead, I sent a simple email to Kyle, my brother, the golden son who always knew better than to get involved, who played neutral so long he forgot that neutrality, in a dysfunctional family, is just another form of complicity. I attached a few screenshots of the card statements, highlighted charges he would recognize, hotel rooms from family reunions, restaurant tabs during birthdays, even the wine club subscription he once praised during a phone call. I didn't ask for support. I didn't make demands. I just gave him the truth, laid bare and undeniable, and let it sit there like a lit match dropped on a gasoline trail. His response came a day later, brief and hesitant. "This is bad." I had no idea. "What are you going to do?" I stared at the message for a long time before replying, finally typing back, "Nothing. I already did it." It wasn't about getting money back. It wasn't even about the debt anymore. It was about balance, about making sure Frank could no longer pretend he stood on solid ground when, in fact, he'd been living off borrowed stability, borrowed respect, borrowed reputation, all of it propped up by the daughter he dismissed as lazy and useless. And then, from an unexpected corner, came the message I hadn't anticipated: Uncle Rick. He called late in the evening, his voice gruff with the weight of too many cigarettes and not enough closure, and he said, "I knew something was off. The way he talked about you, like you were this burden, this dead weight, it never sat right with me." But I didn't say anything. I didn't want to cause waves. That was a mistake. I didn't offer him forgiveness. I didn't need his confession. But hearing someone, anyone, say it out loud, hearing someone acknowledge the lie that had festered at the core of our family dynamic for so long, gave me something I hadn't realized I needed: confirmation that I wasn't crazy, that my silence hadn't been weakness, that my exit had meaning. Back at the house, Frank's panic had started to crystallize into something harder, colder, more dangerous. He'd gone to the bank, tried to open a new account, tried to explain, in his usual blustering way, that there had been a mix-up and that he just needed a temporary line of credit until his real accounts were sorted. But when the banker pulled his credit report and saw the sudden closure of a long-standing account and the outstanding balance in my name, the answer was a firm, quiet no. His score had tanked. His options were shrinking. And the worst part, the part that made it all stick, was that he had no one to blame but himself. I had disappeared from his house, but not from the echo of his decisions. And now, every time he reached for that card, every time he tried to reclaim the illusion of control he'd clung to for so long, he'd be reminded of just how easily it all unraveled the second I stopped playing along. And I hadn't even raised my voice. Weeks passed in a haze of shifting light and changing air, that peculiar late autumn twilight where the sun seems to hesitate longer on the horizon, casting everything in gold that turns to steel by the time it fades, and during that strange in-between, where fall tries to hold its grip before winter swallows the calendar, I found myself watching the days stack like old newspapers, not out of nostalgia or sorrow, but out of something quieter, more complex, a mix of release and realization that I had not simply walked away from my father's house, but from an entire system of emotional taxation I had never agreed to in the first place. It's strange, in a way, how quickly peace can replace pain when the voice that once kept you small has been silenced, not through confrontation, but by the undeniable, irreversible force of consequence. I had started a new job by then, nothing glamorous, just a regional office for a mid-sized logistics firm outside of Des Moines, where the coffee was weak, the printer jammed often, and no one cared what your last name was as long as you hit deadlines and kept the spreadsheets clean. And God, how beautiful that anonymity felt, to be seen not as the disappointing daughter or the failed investment, but simply as someone who showed up, did the work, and went home without having to defend her existence over dinner rolls and forced small talk. I rented a small apartment above a bakery, and every morning, the smell of yeast and sugar and rising dough drifted through my window, reminding me that life, at its best, is simple and repetitive and warm in the most unexpected ways. But even as I rebuilt, brick by careful brick, the world I had been denied while living under Frank's roof, the remnants of that old story refused to stay buried. My phone buzzed one afternoon with a message from Kyle, not his usual perfunctory texts about birthdays or the occasional family check-in, but a longer note, clipped at the edges with guilt, in which he admitted that Frank had called him in a rage the week prior, demanding to know why no one had warned him about the financial trap I had supposedly set. According to Kyle, our father was convinced that I had orchestrated the entire thing from the moment I opened the card to the day I closed it, as some kind of premeditated punishment designed to publicly humiliate him. In his mind, this wasn't a consequence of his actions, but a betrayal engineered by a vindictive daughter seeking vengeance under the guise of independence. Kyle, always the diplomat, tried to soften the blow by suggesting that maybe we all made mistakes, a phrase that stuck in my teeth like undercooked rice, because what he meant was, maybe we all looked away too long while you carried something we refused to acknowledge. And while I understood that he, too, had been shaped by our father's cold shadow, it didn't excuse the comfort he found in neutrality when my world had been on fire. Still, I responded. I told him that I didn't hate Frank, not really, and that I hadn't done any of it to hurt him, but rather to protect myself from the slow, insidious erosion of self-respect that happens when you're told, year after year, that you owe your existence to someone who sees you as a burden. I told him that I hoped Dad would figure it out, not the money, not the credit score, not the logistical mess of reapplying for cards or fixing his finances, but the deeper truth, the one none of them wanted to say out loud, that for years, he had benefited from the labor, loyalty, and silence of someone he refused to treat as an equal. Carl said nothing after that, and I didn't expect him to. Some truths are too uncomfortable to reply to, especially when they sit like a mirror you've spent your whole life avoiding. Then, just when I thought the dust might finally settle, I received a letter, a thin, formal envelope with my name printed in a stiff serif font, postmarked from our hometown. Inside was a legal notice, nothing aggressive, nothing terrifying, but enough to make my stomach sink. It was a reminder, buried in fine print and quiet language, that years ago, during one of those early financial scrambles, Frank had taken out a small personal loan, ostensibly for home improvements that never materialized, and had used my name as a cosigner, something he'd justified at the time with the same casual arrogance he applied to everything. It'll help build your credit. Don't worry about it. It's a family thing. At 23, I hadn't questioned it. At 32, I realized the signature had bound me to another shadow, one that now rose from the past like smoke from a fire I didn't know was still burning. I sat on the edge of my bed, letter in hand, rereading the lines like they might rearrange themselves into something more forgiving, but of course they didn't. The facts were simple. The loan was behind. Payments had stopped. My name was still on it. And now, the lender wanted to know who would be responsible for bringing the balance up to date. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't even curse his name, though Lord knows he deserved it. I just sat there, staring out the window at the parking lot below, where a couple of teenagers were laughing beside a rusted pickup truck, the kind of simple, ordinary joy that feels light years away when your past keeps dragging its claws into your present. Eventually, I folded the letter and slid it into a drawer, not to ignore it, but to delay the moment I'd have to decide, once again, how much more of my life I was willing to clean up after a man who saw my existence as a convenience until it became an inconvenience. And maybe that's the heart of it, not the money, not the card, not even the public insult at Thanksgiving dinner that triggered the collapse. Maybe the truth is that there comes a point when you stop wanting reconciliation, when the apology you've waited your whole life to hear no longer matters, because the damage wasn't done by one explosive moment, but by 1,000 small ones, whispered over years, soaked into your identity until you begin to wonder if you were ever valuable to begin with. As I stood and poured myself a drink, the December air creeping through the old windows like a warning of the winter to come, I realized that the hardest part of breaking free isn't the departure, it's what comes after. When you have to rebuild your understanding of yourself without the warped lens of people who only ever saw you as a reflection of their disappointment. And yet, even as I braced myself for another round of consequences I didn't ask for, even as I stared down another financial mess left in the wake of a man too proud to admit he needed help, I knew one thing with absolute clarity. I wasn't going back. Not to the house. Not to the dynamic. Not to the girl who said yes just to keep the peace. Frank could keep his silence, his broken chair, and his crumbling reputation. He could keep his pride. I'd keep my freedom.